Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be breaking down Rita and everything you need to know about her, including her mechanics, her partner, her set, her team, my own personal deck, and what I've chosen for her, alongside her strengths and weaknesses. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. The first thing you should know about Rita, of course, is that she is a psionic justice character. Now, as of basically the more recent characters being released, including Narja and Tifera, it's become much more obvious that characters can be built in basically any way that you see fit. This means that some of the more quote-unquote support characters may be able to pivot into more damage dealing sort of decks or kits, which is fine, as again, the point of Chaos Zero Nightmare is to have flexibility, and it's more of a roguelike, and you could choose whatever path or whatever build that you want, which is fine. Amazing. That said, we should actually talk about her cards and how she works. So let's start with Rita's starting cards. Yes, as you've probably noticed, these are pretty expensive cards, though they do deal pretty respectable damage by themselves. On that note, we also have Rewind, which is very obviously just a card that most players are going to get rid of once you actually adjust and deal with the deck. However, as we move to Chrono Archon, this is where things get a bit more interesting. Chrono Archon is the way that Rita is able to actually manipulate or start generating her unique resource, and her unique resource, in case you're curious, effectively just acts as a second AP source, which she can then use to exclusively use her own abilities, which, again, given how high and how costly they are, is a great thing. That said, we also have Time Axis Collapse, which is her, I guess I should say, one of the more main or high damage dealing abilities in her kit. And with this, though it reads currently as not an amazing amount of damage, it does also have the increased damage amount by 20% for each cost of card in hand effect, with it scaling up to 200%, and its epiphanies also being fantastic. Now, Now, on that note, Future Decreed will look very similar to something that you may have seen with Narja's deck, where once you're able to actually affect or implement her epiphanies, this is one of the more useful cards that you can have in her hand, though whether or not you choose to duplicate this is mostly dependent on whether you're playing her as a supportive character or a DPS character. Chrono Circle is an interesting card as well, as this creates her DPS sort of playstyle much more, or makes her DPS playstyle much more efficient. And with this, it allows you to create Fate Imprints, which again are another source of damage, and this can definitely increase not just the amount of AP that you are able to generate or the amount of damage that you're able to effectively save, but also increase the amount of damage that you deal once you get to and you actually activate these epiphanies. The final card that we have here is Time Paradox, and effectively this just gets rid of all the present Chronicle that you have. As you could read here, by the way, the effect of Chronicle is that at the start of turn, you decrease all Chronicle and you gain Chronicle Ascension for each decrease with a max of 6, and when you have Chronicle Ascension, you're unable to gain normal Chronicle. Yes, this is a little bit confusing, and I apologize, as this is something that it feels like you kind of have to sit there and understand and look at specifically to really grasp. No real explanation of this outside of a very funny subreddit explanation that I've seen makes full sense of this, and even despite reading it, I feel like it's still something that you have to sit down and really analyze or understand to see where you're gaining this extra AP for and where you are then converting it into a different resource. On that note, as you could read here on the bottom with Chronal Ascension, it reads that when Rita's basic or unique card is used, using a Chronal Ascension as cost, unable to gain Chronicle for cost used through, or rather, I should say, when Rita's basic or unique card is used, you use Chrono Cost as the cost of the card, and you're also unable to gain Chronicle for costs used through Chronal Ascension. Sorry, a lot of cr sounds in this description. However, at the end of this, you get rid of any Ascension that you have, which is kind of how she's able to stack or kind of, well, balance and not have 500 AP every turn, as she is a character that would otherwise stack a lot of AP back to back. Now, all this aside, the main things that you should keep in mind when you're playing Rita is that, again, there are a lot of different ways to play her. For her epiphanies specifically, this is no more obvious or no more true than with Chrono Archon. For myself personally, though, I feel like having the Chronal Ascension and having this Chronicle at the start of every turn is quite efficient. Having this is also fine if you decide to end up pairing or using this alongside a character like Nine or other characters that exhaust more frequently. However, again, just in general, I found that really having this general 3 chronicle is very versatile in of itself, which is something that I prefer. But as we move to time axis collapse, this is where things change quite a bit in terms of what you may prioritize. Now again, for my own personal, or for what I personally am interested in, I was definitely going to be using Rita as more of a DPS, and with this I found that the vulnerability alongside retain and being able to effectively just hold this card multiple times in my hand until I was able to stack tons of damage was pretty nice. Otherwise, of course, if you also want to do something like increasing the damage of the attack cards, this could also work, though again, I would argue that time axis collapse is definitely an extremely high scaling damage ability if you can actually stack it properly. That said, you could also change the cost of all fate imprint in hand to 4, but this feels more specific or niche to what the purpose of this epiphany is. And again, if this ends up being something in the future where a boss makes this viable, feel free to change or adjust your epiphanies as you see fit, but for now, I personally prefer this vulnerable as you're able to continuously stack or deal lots of damage back to back to back. Now, on that note, we should also talk about Future Decreed, as though time axis is definitely something that you would focus on secondarily or equally if you're playing DPS Rita, Future Decreed is where her utility kind of starts to shine. Now, I would argue the main selling point of this deck is if you're able to, again, get free or a lower cost, basically a lower cost for some of these abilities, as they are extremely expensive. But keep in mind, of course, that you are also able to use Future Decreed or a card like Future Decreed to effectively act as like a free fighting spirit or a cheaper fighting spirit for other characters on your team. With that, though, I haven't found an extreme or an amazing amount of use, or a super amount of use for Future Decreed, outside of if you're just using an expensive character like Nine or Haru, who I imagine is likely the main reason why this even exists. It's still a very good card, even if you end up using this for yourself, or again, having the ability to use an extra or a random 3-cost attack card is always very helpful. I also found that activating 2 random 2-cost cards is also pretty nice, especially if you aren't just being used as a 9 damage dealing bot, but you also want to just get out more damage yourself. On that note, we should also talk about Chrono Circle, as this is again where a lot of her damage will basically come from too, assuming that you're able to stack and generate fate imprints. Now, I do also want to mention that despite there being lots of options here, and despite there being things for basically every character, whether that's an ascension, whether that's in a draw, whether that's for an exhaust, I found that, again, just having this raw 3 fate imprint was extremely valuable. I could also see the value in something like a retain if you feel that it's too expensive or too costly, but as we'll see later in my deck, it's not too difficult to find something like a draw or an additional divine epiphany effect on Chrono Circle. And again, since it is only 1 cost and you'd effectively get a free Chrono Circle generator, this can feel super impactful. But again, this may be a bit of bias towards just appreciating the 0-cost cards in the game, as let's be honest, basically anything that costs 0 feels extremely free. It feels very flexible. It feels very unrestricting for your deck, as it's what exactly it sounds like. It's a free throw-out card. You're able to use this for, again, the damage dealing abilities of Fate Imprint. You could use this to generate cards that you'll then use for cost or for Chronicle. It is what it is. Finally, we have Time Paradox, and this is also pretty nice, of course, if you're trying to convert or if you're trying to gain more Chronal Ascension. And again, depending on what you're using this for, if you're trying to use this to cast more abilities or cast more skills or cast more cards, that's fine. Just a generally nice card, though again, it is unique, so you aren't able to duplicate it. The next thing we should talk about, however, is partners. Now, of course, Ivy is fantastic, and I would actually argue that my performance with someone like Ivy as opposed to others is quite good. And even if you just read what her effect is, it is pretty significant. It increases her attack, or rather the equipper's attack, by 8%. And when using a 2-cost or higher Justice attribute card, it increases the damage of the next attack card used by 25%. And this is pretty significant and noticeable, especially since, well, Rita is kind of a damage dealing machine, especially once you're able to stack and get a more proper deck going. On that note, I do want to say that in terms of the value of this, and despite there being illusory erosion, which I find to also be pretty nice, there are certain ego skills or ego cards in the game that feel extremely clutch, and I don't necessarily feel like a new visitor is necessarily that. Don't get me wrong, it is a significant or is a very nice added amount of damage to begin with, and you are able to one turn kill in some cases with Rita if you are able to stack something like illusory erosion alongside all of the other damage in her kit. But I just wanted to point out that in certain cases there are cards that may need you or require you to get a or you may find yourself in a position where you need to AoE, clear all the enemies off field, and it may save your Chaos Zero run or your Chaos System run, and this is definitely not something like that. I don't know if I would say that this is more of like a win more sort of ego skill. And again, it isn't super expensive to begin with, but I just wanted to point this out as, again, this is probably not the same as something like a Clutch Ray ultimate. It's not really the same as something like a 9 ultimate, and it's definitely not something similar to like a Serennial ultimate, which again could definitely get you out of a pinch. That said, again, there aren't many cards in general that really feel that way. You could argue that some of the other cards that you equip for other characters, including some of the more supportive cards, I believe it's with Nyx. Nyx herself also has a pretty impactful passive where you're able to discard, and this can sometimes let you reshuffle or basically reroll your hand if you're in a pinch. That doesn't really seem to be the case though with Ivy, which again is fine. It's a more organized and more prepared as opposed to reactive partner. That said, if you are looking for other cards or other decks to use, or rather other partners to use, there's a lot that you could use depending on who you decided to pick. If you're looking for more damage, it's fine in theory to use Itsuku. If you also want to, well, just use something like Zetera, that's also fine. But of course, most of this cost or most of these options here are dependent on what you actually have available rather than what you've upgraded. Eloise is again also fine if you're just looking for damage, but you'll also probably notice at this point that there aren't an insane amount of utility based cards for the psionic role as you're seeing right here. But of course, I don't have access to every single one. And so if you have other options that you're looking for, I'm sure there are so many other cooks that you could have for Rita already, though I do want to caution that her damage is not insignificant, and though you may be playing towards a more buff the 9 or buff a one-shotter sort of playstyle, that doesn't mean that Rita's damage is insignificant either. On that note, we should also talk about the sets that she will have access to and effectively just her memory fragments. Now, I found the Line of Justice 4-piece set to be extremely strong on her. However, if you decide to also use something like the new Justice set that released alongside 9, this is also fine too, as again, it increases the damage of Justice and Order exhaust attack cards, and wouldn't you believe it, that's exactly what Rita has. That said, if you are looking for a 2-piece effect, I've found that effectively at this point, it just looks and feels better when you have more crit damage. Now, again, there are likely other ways or certain scenarios where a basic card or having the 2-piece effect of an increased basic or, increasing the damage of basic cards could be, I guess, competitive. But for most 99% of DPS, it feels like Executioner's Tool is just too general, it's too versatile, it does quite well. Though again, I'm sure that running something like Blackwing or any of the other 2-piece effect is fine, though again, in terms of how well things like attack and percent scales in this game, it feels like attack percent is not nearly as good as it could be in other titles, as again, a lot of the attack that you're looking at is extremely low even from a statistical or like a mathematical calculation sort of feel. Anyways, math aside, we should also talk about some of the teams that you may experience when you're using or trying to play with someone like Rita. If we move to the event, honestly, a lot of what you'll see currently is basically Tifera or 9 spam. I do also want to point out that as we move to Chaos, it has felt extremely difficult at times to use someone like Rita without having a healer. Now again, I am using sometimes in most cases, I'm using something like a healer DPS and like a flex third slot to push some of the tier 16s or tier 15 save datas depending on what I get like access to or what I'm lucky with. But the reality is that for me, I haven't found a huge amount of success with removing someone like Rita, or rather leaving Rita as the more supportive cast member. It really does feel like you do need a third healer, and though I am a big fan of characters like Tifera, it feels a little bit odd for me to use a team like Rita, Tifera, and Nine, for instance, even if I'm trying to use Tifera and Rita as the supportive cast members, as it doesn't feel like there's enough healing, and unless if I'm using Ironclad with Nine, it feels extremely fragile. And again, there isn't much healing to go around, though I obviously understand that Tifera does have access to heals in general. Now, that said, it could also be a bit of a skill issue, RNG loss, but just from the about 12 to like 15 runs that I've done with Rita at this point, that has been my experience while trying to find a deck for her. Now, I do also want to talk about I do want to also talk about the other alternative characters that you may use with her. And again, the most obvious I feel from this list is going to be someone like Haru. Now, the reality with Haru is that there are a lot of different sort of restrictions to playing Haru. Now, I don't necessarily mean Haru in terms of like I am unable to play Haru because she has extremely high costs, but rather just managing so much AP in a deck feels a little bit I'd like to say it's a little bit confusing at times, or it's a little it requires a lot of like foresight into what you expect your hand or what you expect the enemy to do. Long story short, I feel that if you are very familiar with what the enemies are going to do, or what part of the run you're in, or even if you're, I would say more likely, or it's probably easier if you're doing something like a save data run for you to actually understand or to utilize something like Haru more efficiently. But while you're just going through something like Chaos, I definitely did not have a whole lot of fun playing something like Haru, Rita, and I don't know, a character like Tifera or Narja. Though again, these are characters that definitely feel a lot better once you're able to actually find a proper deck. On that note, I do also want to talk about the deck that I myself have had. For the appeal of the character for me, I wanted to deal damage with her, and as a result, my save data looks like this at the moment. Now, again, you've probably noticed it, but you'll see it right now. I've got Chrono Archon. I've got 3 time axis collapses. I had an epiphany here and I duplicated it, which is why it removed my 4th card. I did have a 4th time axis collapse, which is fine. It is what it is. But you've also, you could obviously see this. I have one of the future decrees. I don't think that this is necessarily the best for what I have. I do think I could get away with maybe having the 2 cost 2 random cards are used, but even in terms of gear, I found the Millennium Arbor to be extremely strong. There are tons of other options that you could use. However, I think also having Mask of Flames is really nice, as again, it pairs very well with the time axis collapse here, which also has vulnerable itself, and it's just extra damage. I wasn't really able to get something like Dimensional Cube or a Rage Potion for my gauntlet, or rather for my ring slot, but anything that increases damage here would be pretty nice. Though again, keep in mind that a lot of this is RNG, so use what you will. As for alternatives to some of these, if you don't have access to something like Mask of Flames, I would also recommend using something like the Vine Armor that has to do with evasion. And if you can find, again, something like Millennium Arbor, which is not too difficult, I'd also recommend getting something like Dimensional Cube to fill out a triple, quote-unquote, like blue set and isn't super rare or difficult to find. Though again, this is very dependent on how you're trying to play her, as you could easily take something like the Tentacle that gives team-wide damage if you're trying to play her support, alongside other more supportive options as well. Now, on that note, I do also admit that having the draw 1 feels really nice, but if you're looking for other epiphanies on other cards, that's fine too. Just keep in mind that, again, the process of trying to RNG find some of these is very difficult. And if we just take a moment to observe likely what other players have done with their great riffs and their end game content, we can also take a look at what some of the end game builds have already shaped out to be. If I take a look at here, we could already take a look at it. And okay, if we move to Masters, you'd probably see a lot of Rita builds already. You can kind of tell though from their, You can kind of tell from these buildos, like I said, some of these are going to be very different. This one is obviously a bit more supportive based, or it looks a bit more supportive based. They've got a draw, they've got wow, look at this. This is Flames of Eternity. They've got Reorganized. This is like, this looks like a bit more of a what is it, a dual use case sort of, or a multi-purpose sort of Rita. It looks like she has a bit of damage here. It doesn't look like she's strictly built for utility, which I think is pretty cool. We have another one here which we can take a look at. This one as well doesn't have too many of the too many duplicates in general either, but you could also see like this one decides to, or has decided to use the random damage dealt. I do also want to point out though that though some of these builds, or some of these builds with Rita are fantastic and they're fine, and I'm sure they're cooking as most characters or most players are, the reality is that what you may need for a specific boss, or against a boss like the current golden main, is likely going to be different than what you'd expect from something like Basin, something that you'd expect from something like a future Great Rift, as again, not a lot of these are super, or this specifically is a boss that's obviously specifically tuned with her in mind and has a specific playstyle with her in mind. But as you could read by yourself just through this, like the amplify effects increase the damage of Order and Justice cards, it increases the cost of exhaust cards, and again, it increases the damage dealt for each cost of the attack card activated with a max of 30 stacks. Now again, point of this being that the stacks, or rather the builds that you see with Rita right now, may not even be exactly what she can work with, or what she will find effective in the current Great Rift. It could be something that later down the road you'll have to change. If you want to make a build specifically for Great Rift to push for the top, you could always take a look at what the top level players, or what the top level players are doing, kind of reinvent, or kind of what I guess what's the word, build backwards and kind of understand or recalculate or calculate yourself why exactly they have these sorts of builds. But just in general, I found that what I have with Rita is pretty fine. I've cleared effectively everything I need to with this build. Having the neutral cards that they have, I think, is also fine. Having things like Reorganized are also, or I should say, are also generally very effective. But the last thing I want to touch on is potentials, as again, some of these are pretty nice. Now, you will probably notice from this, by the way, that a lot of these are more damage based. I mean, she has crit rate and crit damage as her free stats, or rather the stats that you can upgrade her with. She increases her own attack. She increases the damage multiplier of time acceleration, which I believe is her basic attack. And even with this is another increased damage to the basic attack card too. So overall, though you definitely could build her like a support, you could play her also as a hybrid. You could even play her as a full DPS too. I think really Rita and a lot of the more recent characters who've been released, like the Tiferas and even the Narjas of the world, feel very similar in the sense that you aren't super locked into one playstyle, and rather CZN at the moment is definitely rewarding players who choose to, again, be more flexible, find make the most out of the divine epiphanies that you have. And with this, I find Rita, at least right now, to be pretty solid. I definitely don't think she's a must pull, but obviously if you're trying to score high on the Great Rift at the moment, though there are some scores up there that don't have Rita in there, she's obviously very tuned towards or designed for this specific Great Rift. That's going to be it for today's video though, guys. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.